That evening, I walked out of the hospital room, leaving my whole life behind. My wife was dying, and I had held her hand until the drips came to a stop. I didn't know how to go on. But as I stepped into the hallway, hunched and broken, I heard my son's voice. He was behind me, speaking to the nurse. His words were cold, confident, and held neither fear nor grief. He thought I had already left. But I stopped, and what he said changed the rest of my old age forever. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Harold Rivers. I was 76 years old when I watched my wife die. For most of my life, I fixed boat engines along the Maine coast, in a small workshop that smelled of grease and salt and pine sap. My hands were never idle, and my back bent early, like the old boats I kept afloat long after others gave up on them. I was a practical man, slow with words and stubborn with silence. My wife, Louise, was the only one who ever understood how I spoke without speaking. That night, I sat beside her bed in the hospital room that hummed and beeped and smelled like disinfectant and cotton. Her breathing was shallow, like wind struggling through a torn sail. Her skin was pale, stretched thin across her bones. I held her hand in mine, and it felt so small. I traced the ridges of her knuckles with my thumb, the way I used to check wood grain for hidden rot. I couldn't find the words to say goodbye, so I just sat there, my coat unzipped, my cap on my lap, watching her chest rise and fall. The room was lit by one dim lamp above her bed. Shadows played across the ceiling. I counted her breaths in rhythm with the machine that monitored her heart. I had fixed hundreds of machines in my time, but this one I couldn't control. It betrayed me every time it slowed, and every time it found strength again, it gave me false hope. The nurses came and went like ghosts. They moved gently, professionally, as if death was just a protocol. One of them adjusted her IV and whispered something I didn't catch. I nodded anyway. I didn't want to speak. My voice felt like it belonged to someone else. I hadn't used it since the morning. Louise had opened her eyes for a moment around sunrise, looked at me, and smiled. It wasn't a strong smile. It was a memory of a smile, one she'd worn many times over the years, especially when I tracked mud through the kitchen or forgot to bring in the wash. It said, "I know you. I forgive you. I love you." That was the last time she looked at me. The rest of the day, her eyes stayed closed. She didn't respond when I told her the seagulls were loud outside the window, or when I mentioned that I'd called our grandson. I told her the tide was high and the sun was warm, even though I hadn't stepped outside. I lied to her, maybe for the first time in decades. I didn't want her to know that the world had already started moving on without her. In my head, I kept hearing the sound of waves hitting the dock, not from outside, but from inside me. It was an echo, a rhythm I had lived with for years. The sea was a part of me. So was she. And now, both were slipping away. When the doctor came in that evening, he stood quietly for a while, looking at the monitors. He didn't say much, just a few facts, some medical language, and a look that told me this would be our last night. I nodded. There was no panic in me, just a slow unraveling. I felt like an old rope left in the sun too long. As the minutes passed, her breath grew fainter. I pressed her hand to my lips. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried since my father's funeral when I was 17, but something inside me felt like it had cracked. Not shattered, just cracked, like the hull of a boat that took on water without sinking. I whispered her name once, not loud, not for her to hear, really, just to feel it in my mouth one more time. I remembered the way she said my name when she was tired, low, stretched out, soft at the end. I remembered how she used to wait on the porch for me when I came home late from the shop, arms folded, half smiling. The machines began to slow. One by one, their rhythm changed. The heart monitor drew longer lines between each beep. I didn't call for anyone. I didn't want strangers to come in and mark the time of death. I just wanted the moment to stay between us. When the last sound faded, I sat still for a long time. Her hand had grown colder. Her mouth was slightly open. Her wedding ring looked too big for her finger now. I reached over and brushed a lock of gray hair from her forehead. She had never liked her hair messy, even when we were camping in the back of the truck 30 years ago. The nurse eventually returned and touched my shoulder. I nodded, stood up slowly, and placed her hand gently on her chest. She looked small in that bed, like a paper boat drifting out into the bay. I backed away, watching her face for the last time. There was peace there, and something else too. Something I couldn't name, like the smell of home after a storm. I walked out of the room without looking back. My knees felt heavy, and my hands had lost their purpose. My whole body felt foreign, like I had borrowed it for too long and it was time to return it. The hallway was quiet. The lights above hummed. The tiles reflected a distorted version of me. Shorter, older, emptier. As I reached the corner of the corridor, I slowed. There was a sound behind me. A voice, familiar and sharp, carried softly in a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. My son. His tone was light, steady, rehearsed. He was talking to the nurse. I stopped without turning around. And when I heard what he said, my heart beat once, hard, like the echo of an old drum. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, taking in the truth. The night had already broken me, but his words finished what the silence began. I didn't turn around. I just stared at the floor. The moment held me still, like a frozen wave, suspended before the crash. I realized then that everything I thought I understood about grief, about family, about the roles we played, was about to change. And the man who had entered that room to say goodbye wasn't the same man who now stood in that corridor, holding nothing but breath and memory. The hallway stretched ahead, like a tunnel, with no end. I walked slowly, the rubber soles of my shoes making soft sounds against the tile. Each step felt disconnected from the next, as if I were walking on a moving floor I hadn't agreed to stand on. The lights overhead buzzed quietly, but even that faint noise seemed distant. I passed closed doors on either side, each one hiding someone else's story, someone else's heartbreak or healing. None of it touched me. I had stepped into a space beyond emotion. The hospital corridor was designed for movement, but I moved like a man underwater. The world had turned soft and thick, like fog pressing against my chest. The smell of antiseptic was sharp in my nostrils, and the air felt colder the farther I moved from her room. Each breath I took felt too loud in my lungs. There was a small bench near the elevator. I sat down on it and stared at the wall in front of me. Beige. Unremarkable. The paint chipped in one corner where a gurney must have scraped it. That chip held my gaze for several minutes. I imagined the moment it happened. The clumsy angle, the irritated nurse, the silent apology. Even damage had a story. Even the wall remembered. I pressed my hands between my knees and leaned forward. I wasn't crying. The tears hadn't come. Instead, there was a stillness inside me, so complete, it felt like something had stopped working. My heart still beat, my lungs still filled, but somewhere deeper, the mechanism had jammed, like a gear in one of my outboard engines, frozen with rust. The silence around me wasn't empty. It was full of what wasn't being said. The nurse behind the desk didn't look up. A janitor passed by with a mop, humming faintly to himself, and I noticed how deliberately he avoided eye contact. Everyone was trained not to intrude on grief, but this wasn't grief. Not yet. It was something earlier, something quieter and more confusing, like walking into a room and forgetting why you came. My hand drifted to my coat pocket, searching for something. I didn't know what. I found a folded napkin, a receipt, an old fishing license. I held the license for a moment. The date expired 2 years ago. Louise had insisted I renew it, even though I hadn't fished in almost a decade. She liked the idea that I could go back to it one day. She said it kept me connected to who I used to be. I slipped it back into my pocket. Time moved differently on that bench. Minutes stretched thin, pulled apart by memory and fatigue. My body wanted to rest, but my mind replayed the image of her face over and over again. The way her lips had parted slightly, the way the light had fallen across her cheekbones. I didn't want to leave the hospital, but I couldn't stay. There was no purpose left in that building for me. And yet, walking away felt like betrayal. Eventually, I stood. My knees cracked as I straightened. I turned toward the elevator and pressed the button. The metal doors opened with a soft hiss. I stepped inside and stared at my reflection in the dull paneling. I looked like someone else. In the lobby, everything was brighter. There were people talking, a vending machine humming, a man arguing over a phone near the entrance. I moved through it like a shadow. No one stopped me. No one needed to. Outside, the night was sharp and windless. The sky above the parking lot was navy blue, without stars. I walked slowly toward my truck, parked near the far corner under a broken streetlight. The silence followed me. It filled the space between my footsteps, between the engine and my thoughts, between the rearview mirror and the empty seat beside me. I sat behind the wheel, but didn't start the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel, motionless. I watched the windshield slowly fog from my breath. The hospital behind me glowed faintly through the rearview mirror. I couldn't look at it directly. It was no longer a place of help. It was the last place I had been whole. The silence inside the truck matched the silence I carried within me. I didn't know what to do with it. It didn't ask anything. It didn't hurt. It just existed, dense and patient. I adjusted the rearview mirror out of habit, though there was nothing I needed to see behind me. The road home lay ahead, but home no longer had meaning. It was now a house with walls that wouldn't answer back. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine rumbled reluctantly to life. I sat there with the motor running, staring through the windshield at the empty space ahead. There was no music, no plan, no destination that made sense, only the next step, and the one after that. As I pulled out of the lot, I didn't look back at the hospital. It had taken something from me, something irreplaceable. I drove slowly, the tires whispering against the road. Streetlights passed overhead, casting brief shadows across the dashboard. My thoughts wandered as I drove, not to the past, not yet, just to the silence. It had become my companion. The seat beside me, once filled by her voice and her laughter, was now occupied by a silence that breathed and waited and remembered. At a red light, I glanced to my right and saw an elderly man standing at a bus stop. He looked cold, tired, folded inward. We didn't acknowledge each other. We didn't need to. There was a shared understanding in our age, in the way we stood, in the way we waited for things that never quite came the way we hoped. When the light changed, I drove on. I passed the old fire station, the bakery that had closed during the pandemic, the elementary school where my grandson used to play. Every building was the same, but nothing felt familiar. It was as if I had left something behind that tethered me to this place, and now I was just a visitor. I pulled into my driveway. The porch light was on. I had left it that way when we went to the hospital. It greeted me like a lie, pretending nothing had changed. I parked the truck and sat for a while, unwilling to open the door. I imagined her voice saying something about the cold, urging me inside. I imagined the creak of the stairs as she came down to meet me. But there was only silence. Eventually, I opened the door and stepped out. The gravel crunched beneath my boots. I climbed the stairs slowly, each one sounding louder than I remembered. The key turned in the lock with a familiar click. I pushed open the door and stepped into the dark. The house smelled like her shampoo. I hadn't noticed before, but now it hit me like a wave. The walls stood silent, watching me. They didn't offer comfort. They didn't offer anything. They had absorbed years of voices, footsteps, laughter. Now they were still. I walked into the kitchen and turned on the light. The table was set for two. I had forgotten we had left it that way. A plate, a cup, a folded napkin. It was unbearable in its normalcy. I sat down in my chair and stared across at the empty seat. The silence pressed closer. It filled every corner. It knew me better than anyone else now. It didn't ask for answers. It didn't offer hope. It just stayed. And so did I. The morning after, the light came in slowly through the kitchen window, brushing over the old countertops and the faded linoleum, like it wasn't sure if it still belonged there. I sat at the table with my hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. I hadn't slept. I hadn't tried. The bed felt too wide. The sheets still held the shape of her body, and I couldn't bring myself to disturb that final imprint. So I stayed in the kitchen, watching the hours crawl by with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the house settling around me. The silence was different now. It wasn't sacred. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful, like something waiting for me to crack. Every drawer I opened, every cabinet door I touched, carried a memory. The coffee mugs with chipped rims, the teaspoon bent just slightly at the neck, the jar of strawberry jam she never got around to opening. Her handwriting on the grocery list still magneted to the fridge. All of it stood as evidence that she had been here. And all of it mocked me because she wasn't anymore. The front door opened without warning. I didn't flinch. I didn't turn around. I just sat there and listened to the slow, familiar creak of footsteps coming down the hall. My son's voice followed, casual and rehearsed, the same tone he used when talking to real estate clients or neighbors he didn't care about. He said something about checking in on me, making sure I was eating, that sort of thing. He laid a paper bag on the counter and said it was soup. I didn't move. He moved through the house like he already knew its rhythm better than I did. He walked into the living room, paused, maybe expecting something to greet him. Her voice, a smell, a habit. But there was only the echo of his own presence. He came back to the kitchen and stood across from me. I could feel his eyes on me, searching for signs. Signs of weakness, signs of readiness, signs of surrender. Then he laid something on the table, a manila folder. He slid it toward me like a quiet challenge. I didn't look at it at first. I stared at my coffee and waited. He said something about arrangements, about legal matters, about practicalities. I heard the words, but they passed through me like wind through an empty shed. He mentioned the house, the accounts, the future. His tone never shifted. No mourning, no tremble, just plans. I reached out and touched the edge of the folder. It was thick, heavy. I opened it slowly, half out of instinct, half because I wanted to feel something solid in my hands. Inside were papers, printed, notarized, neatly clipped, titles, authorizations, proposals, power of attorney. He had filled them out already. All they needed were my initials, my signature, my consent. His voice hovered over me, still calm, still explaining. It was all to make things easier, he said. For me. For everyone. I didn't speak. I traced the corner of one page with my finger, feeling the roughness of the paper, the slight indentation of a signature line. My name was typed neatly at the top of the page. It looked foreign to me, like the name of someone who had already left the world and was now being processed. He mentioned an account, one he had opened in my name. He said it was to keep things organized, said he'd already moved some of the funds there to get started. He called it a transition. That word sat in my chest like a stone. A transition, like changing light bulbs or repainting a room. He was transitioning me out of my own life, step by step, with folders and bank accounts and soft reassurances. I nodded slowly and closed the folder. He seemed pleased. He took that as agreement. He said something about meeting with someone next week. He'd handle it. He always handled things, didn't he? I heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him. I stared at the folder for a long time. It sat on the table like a bribe wrapped in civility. A promise of peace in exchange for my silence. A check, not written in dollars, but in control. If I signed, I would make his life easier. I would step aside. I would disappear without a scene. The coffee had turned bitter on my tongue. I stood and walked to the sink. I poured it out slowly, watching the dark stream swirl down the drain. My hands shook, not from age, but from something else. From the awareness that I had become a figure in someone else's future. A placeholder. A detail to be managed. I walked through the house, slowly. Every room felt staged now, like it had been prepped for sale. The blankets folded too neatly, the curtains drawn just enough. It no longer smelled like her perfume. It smelled like change. Uninvited, unearned, unstoppable change. The kind that creeps in through the floorboards and rearranges your life before you notice. In the bedroom, the closet door was ajar. I looked inside and saw her clothes still hanging, pressed, clean, untouched. He hadn't touched them yet. Maybe he hadn't dared. Or maybe he was saving that for later, when I was out of the way. I returned to the kitchen and sat back down. The folder still waited. I picked it up and read the first page again. It asked me to release control, to acknowledge that I could no longer handle the weight of my own affairs. It asked me to surrender quietly, for the sake of convenience, for the illusion of love. I didn't sign. I closed the folder and placed it neatly on the edge of the table. That night, I didn't sleep again. I sat in the living room, surrounded by shadows that used to be furniture. I listened to the walls, to the way they held the echoes of her footsteps. I knew then that silence had a price, and I had been paying it for years without knowing. But this check, this attempt to finalize my erasure, this was different. This was deliberate, and I wasn't sure yet what I would do, but I knew what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't disappear quietly. I returned to the house in the early afternoon, though I had never truly left. My body had stepped outside, walked the sidewalk, driven the familiar roads. But the weight of the house clung to me even beyond its walls. It sat like a stone at the base of my spine, unshakable. Every step toward it felt like surrendering to a tide I could no longer resist. The wind blew softly through the trees lining the driveway. Leaves scraped across the pavement like quiet reminders that the seasons had moved on, even if I hadn't. The porch creaked under my weight. That sound used to be comforting. It had signaled arrival, return, the beginning of a warm evening or the end of a hard day. Now it sounded brittle, like something ready to break. I opened the front door and stepped inside. The smell of the house was no longer hers. The lavender and lemon she used to use had faded. In its place was something stale, something temporary, like the scent of a hotel room where people come and go, leaving no trace. I stood in the entryway for several minutes, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know where else to go. The house didn't reach out to me. It didn't comfort me. It simply allowed me in, like a patient landlord watching an overdue tenant return. I walked into the living room. The couch had been adjusted slightly, the cushions fluffed, the throw blanket folded differently. Not in her way. In someone else's. The remote control sat perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. She never aligned things that precisely. Her order was lived in, forgiving. This was calculated. I noticed the picture frames had been shifted, some dusted clean, while others remained hazy. It was a quiet rearrangement, subtle but loud to someone who knew better. I moved into the kitchen. The bag of soup still sat on the counter from the day before, untouched. I hadn't had the stomach to throw it out yet. I opened the fridge and saw that things had been reorganized. My labels gone, jars facing forward like they were auditioning. He had been here again. Maybe not physically, but his hands were beginning to shape the space, like a sculptor working with clay that didn't belong to him. I sat at the kitchen table and let my eyes trace the grain of the wood. It was the same table where we'd played cards, sorted bills, celebrated birthdays without candles. I had refinished it once, years ago, when a crack had formed down the center. She had said I was too old to do it myself, but I did anyway. And now it looked strong, like it would last longer than I would. I wondered how long it would take him to replace it. The silence in the house wasn't peace. It was observation. I felt watched, not by people, but by time itself, by the years embedded in the floorboards, by the memories that hadn't been properly dismissed, only suspended. They clung to the air, thick and still, waiting for someone to either honor them or erase them. I went upstairs. The hallway felt narrower than I remembered. The light bulb at the far end had burned out, casting the corridor into an uneven dimness. I passed the guest room first. The door was open. The bed was made with hospital corners. That wasn't her touch. I had never made the bed like that either. I stood in the doorway and studied it. It looked like a showroom, pristine, unused, unlived, as if someone was preparing it for a buyer. In our bedroom, the closet doors were open. Her clothes were still there, but fewer than before. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then I counted. The blouses, the scarves, the cardigans she loved. Some were missing. I walked over and ran my fingers along the hanging fabric. It felt wrong, as if someone had reached into a sacred place and pulled something out without asking permission. There was no dust on the empty hangers. This hadn't been accidental. This had been a decision. I opened her dresser drawer. Her jewelry box sat in the corner, its lid slightly askew. I never touched it. That was hers. But now, someone else had. Inside, her brooches were rearranged. A few were gone. The necklace she wore every Sunday. The ring she refused to take off even when washing dishes. My stomach turned. I closed the box slowly and sat down on the edge of the bed. The room spun gently around me. Not fast enough to be dizziness, just enough to remind me that the world was no longer still. I leaned forward and rested my elbows on my knees. The silence pressed in again, denser than ever. It wasn't grief. It was intrusion. Something sacred had been violated, and the house knew it. I stayed like that for a long time. Later, I made my way back downstairs and opened the back door. The yard was overgrown in patches. She used to scold me for not trimming the edges near the rose bushes. The grass had gone yellow near the fence line. I stood on the porch and watched the wind move through the trees. Everything looked the same from a distance, but up close, everything had shifted. I walked to the shed. The door stuck, as always, but I pulled it open and stepped inside. The smell of oil, dust, and cedar hit me. It hadn't changed. My tools were where I left them. No one had touched them yet. I ran a hand over the workbench, leaving a clean streak in the dust. For a moment, I could breathe. I stayed in the shed for a while, surrounded by the things I had built with my hands. Things I had repaired. Things that still worked because I had made them work. In this space, I wasn't a man being moved out of his life. I was still Harold Rivers, fixer of motors, maker of things that lasted. But even here, I felt the gravity of the house behind me, calling me back, reminding me that I couldn't hide in wood and rust forever, that sooner or later I would have to face the quiet inside those walls and decide whether I would allow it to consume me. I returned to the kitchen at dusk. The light had turned gold, slipping sideways through the windows. I didn't turn on the lamp. I sat in the growing dark and listened to the house breathe. It didn't welcome me. It tolerated me. And in that tolerance, I felt the sharp edge of something unspoken. Not mourning, not memory, but warning. I woke up to the smell of something burning. At first, I couldn't place it. I thought maybe it was a dream. But as I sat up in bed, the scent clung to the back of my throat. Sharp, acrid, familiar. It wasn't fire, not flames. It was the faint smell of something scorched. A pan left too long on the stove, toast forgotten in the broiler, wire insulation heated past its limit. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and sat there, listening. The house made no sounds. The bedroom was still dark, the window shades drawn tight. I rose slowly, my knees stiff, my body reluctant. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The scent was stronger now. I followed it, each step measured, cautious. In the kitchen, I found the source. A burner had been left on. A pan sat atop it, empty, blackened at the bottom. No food, no meal, just the memory of heat. The edges of the pan shimmered faintly in the morning light filtering through the blinds. I turned off the burner and stood there, one hand on the stove, the other gripping the back of a chair. I hadn't cooked in days. I hadn't used that pan. It was him. My son must have been here again, quietly, while I slept. Slipping through the house like a contractor measuring walls for demolition. And now he was leaving heat marks behind, careless signs of a presence that was not mine. I opened the back door to air out the room. The cold hit me instantly, a slap of winter air that made my lungs ache. I stood there, staring out at the yard, watching as frost still clung to the tips of the grass. The rose bushes had turned brittle, their branches sharp like wire. I could feel her presence there, in the neglected soil, in the sag of the garden gate. She had once said the smell of burning always made her uneasy. It reminded her of something lost, something left too long unattended. I returned to the stove, picked up the pan with a towel, and dropped it into the sink. The clang echoed through the house like a gavel. I filled the basin with water, letting it hiss and steam. The sound was angry, alive, too loud for the stillness around it. I watched the bubbles gather around the blackened metal. They rose and popped and vanished without leaving anything clean. After a while, I made toast, real toast. I watched it carefully, turned it over halfway through, buttered it while it was still warm. I didn't want it. But it gave my hands something to do. I sat at the table and chewed slowly, each bite tasting like cardboard. I left half of it uneaten. I wasn't hungry. I was studying the silence. The house had a new rhythm now. It had always been quiet. But this was different. It was the quiet of watched places, of a room after interrogation, a place where something had been taken and not yet returned. I felt like a tenant overstaying his welcome, even though my name was still on the deed. Or so I hoped. I opened the manila folder again. It was still where I had left it, neatly positioned at the corner of the table. I flipped through the pages, rereading sections I had already memorized. Everything was perfectly laid out, every page designed to make me obsolete. There was a clause about the property, about the reassignment of utilities, about direct deposits, about recurring payments. Everything was addressed, accounted for, assumed. It was less a request than a resignation letter. All I had to do was sign. I closed the folder and looked out the window. The sun was rising higher, its light catching on the layer of ash smeared faintly across the stovetop. I hadn't noticed it before. The soot from the overheated pan had left a residue, a fingerprint of fire. I wiped it with a cloth. It smeared, but didn't disappear. Later that morning, he arrived. I heard the car door slam, the confident steps up the porch, the sound of the key turning in the lock. He had a key now. He'd made himself a part of this place with metal and silence. I didn't greet him. I didn't stand. He came into the kitchen, saw the pan in the sink, the window open, the smoke still faint in the air. He said nothing. He just opened the fridge, pulled out a bottle of orange juice, and drank straight from it. He talked about errands, about how the utilities were getting expensive, about the importance of simplifying things. He spoke without pause, like someone reading from a brochure. I listened with the patience of an old tree being measured for removal. He looked at the folder. He tapped it twice with the back of his hand. He smiled, said he could get it filed within the week. I looked at him for the first time that day. He didn't see me. He saw a signature. After he left, the house exhaled again. Not relief, not regret, just another shift in pressure. I sat in the living room, watching dust motes dance in the thin sunlight. My eyes drifted to the corner where her chair used to be. Gone now. Moved. Stored. Disappeared. I hadn't asked. I hadn't been told. It was just no longer there. The smell of burning lingered long after the pan had cooled. It seeped into the curtains, into the fabric of the chairs, into my clothes. It clung to my skin, as if the house itself had absorbed the heat and decided to keep it. I thought about fire, about how it starts quiet and small, often invisible at first, a slow heat beneath the surface. You don't see the damage until the structure buckles. That evening, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the bedroom. My hand rested on the frame of the door. I didn't enter. I just stood there, staring into the half-dark room, waiting for something to return. A sound, a scent, a shape. But all that came was the smell of smoke. I turned away and walked back downstairs. I left the lights off. I moved through the dark like a man learning his house for the first time. The wood creaked beneath my feet. The walls breathed. I sat at the table again, the folder in front of me, my name printed at the top. I reached for a pen, but I didn't uncap it. Instead, I let my hand rest beside it. Flat. Steady. And I waited. I spent most of the next day sitting in the den, the one room in the house that still seemed untouched. It wasn't a place Louise had favored. Not really. She always said it felt too cold, too far from the kitchen and the garden. But that morning, the isolation was what I needed. The walls were wood-paneled, lined with the kind of dusty shelves you forget you built. I had kept old manuals there, boxes of fishing tackle, and folders full of appliance warranties that were long expired. The air was dry, still carrying the faint scent of varnish and old magazines. I had stopped pretending to follow a routine. I no longer opened the blinds. I no longer bothered with breakfast unless my stomach ached. The chair in the corner had grown familiar under my weight. I spent hours there, unmoving, like a figure in a museum installation titled "Man Left Behind." I didn't feel sadness. I felt something heavier, something like the weight of paused time pressing on my shoulders. It was around noon when I first heard the thud above me. Not loud, not alarming, just a dull sound, like someone had dropped a heavy book on the floor upstairs. I sat up straighter, my heart pausing before catching up. I waited. Silence followed. I told myself it was nothing. Houses made noises. Old wood swelled and shifted. Pipes contracted. But this was different. This had intention. It came from above, directly above me. From the hallway outside the bedroom. I stood slowly, my joints stiff and reluctant. I walked out of the den and looked up the staircase. Everything was quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that invited suspicion. I climbed the stairs, hand on the railing, eyes watching the hallway ahead like it might shift if I blinked. The bedroom door was open, just as I had left it. Nothing seemed out of place. But as I walked past the closet, I noticed something that didn't belong. A shoe. Not hers. Not mine. A man's loafer, partially hidden beneath the edge of a blanket chest. I bent down, picked it up, studied the sole. Worn, modern, expensive. Definitely not mine. I stood motionless, gripping the shoe in one hand. I tried to recall if I had seen it before, if maybe my son had left it on an earlier visit. But it wasn't his size, and he never wore this kind of shoe. He was a sneakers and blazer type. This was something else. A different presence. I searched the room carefully. The drawers had been opened and shut again, not quite flush. The jewelry box was slightly rotated. The scent in the room was faintly unfamiliar. Cologne, maybe. Something manufactured and slick. My skin prickled. I opened the linen closet and found a towel missing. Only one. A clean folded towel, now absent. It made no sense, and yet it made too much sense. Someone had been here. Not just in the house, but in the spaces we had shared. And they hadn't wanted me to know. Downstairs, the house was still and indifferent. I wandered through each room slowly, searching for signs, patterns, clues that had slipped past me. And that's when I reached the hallway under the stairs. A narrow closet, mostly unused, filled with paint cans and broken picture frames. I hadn't opened it in months. I turned the knob and pulled the door open. The scent hit me immediately. Cigarette smoke, faint, stale, clinging to the air like breath that refused to leave. Louise and I had never smoked. My son didn't either, at least not that I knew. But someone had stood in that cramped space and smoked recently. The walls bore faint smudges, as if a hand had steadied itself there. The floor had new scuff marks near the baseboards. There was no ash, no stubbed-out filter, just the ghost of presence. I stepped inside the closet and stood still. The darkness closed around me like a shell. There was no light in there, just the thin line coming from the door left ajar. The silence was louder in that small space. My breathing echoed slightly. I ran my hand along the wall and touched something smooth, a piece of paper taped at eye level. I stepped back into the hallway and brought the paper into the light. It was a utility estimate, a heating bill. The address was mine. The name on the account was not. It belonged to a woman I didn't know. The bill was dated 2 weeks ago. I sat down on the stairs, the paper trembling in my hands. Not from fear, from something worse. The realization that the house wasn't just being invaded. It was being restructured, rewritten, paper by paper, drawer by drawer, scent by scent. Someone was moving in while I was still there. I returned to the kitchen and pulled out the folder again. This time, I examined it not as a proposal, but as a map. I traced the timeline, the financial transitions, the names attached. There were gaps, small ones, but enough to hint at something planned beneath the surface. Not negligence, not haste, strategy. He wasn't working alone. That night, I didn't turn on any lights. I moved through the house in silence, listening, waiting. I sat in the den with the door cracked open and watched the hallway for hours. Nothing happened. No footsteps. No voices. Just the same dry hush that had swallowed the house since her death. At some point, I drifted into sleep. My dreams were shallow, fragmented. I saw the closet under the stairs, its walls closing in, the scent of smoke surrounding me. I heard a voice, one I didn't recognize, whispering my name like a question. When I woke, the first thing I noticed was that the den door was now completely open. I had left it only ajar. The second thing I noticed was the faint imprint of a shoe in the carpet. One step, just inside the room. I rose and walked to the window. The sky outside was pale gray, the dawn just beginning to stretch its fingers over the trees. I didn't feel fear. I felt confirmation. There was a shadow in my house, and it wasn't mine. The day started with frost across the window panes. A thin white veil coated the glass like breath frozen in place. I traced my finger along the edge of the window, leaving a streak of warmth that disappeared just as quickly. Outside, The trees stood still, their branches bare, unmoving in the dead morning air. Everything looked frozen, but I knew that beneath the surface, things were shifting. I hadn't turned the heat on yet, not because I was trying to save money, but because warmth felt undeserved. The house didn't need comfort. Neither did I. The cold helped me think. It slowed my movements, kept me in the present. It reminded me that nothing, not even time, could be trusted when it moved too fast. I made tea instead of coffee. It felt less like habit and more like a decision. The kettle shrieked louder than usual. I poured the water into a chipped ceramic mug Louise had bought at a church fundraiser decades ago. Her favorite. I had almost dropped it twice that week, both times catching it mid-fall with a reflex I didn't know I still had. I wasn't ready to let it break. Not yet. At the kitchen table, I opened the same folder again. The pages were dog-eared now. I had read them too many times. The print was beginning to blur from the oil of my fingertips. I stared at the signature line, my name sitting there in prelude, a space waiting for ink. But that morning, I wasn't looking for signatures. I was looking for gaps. I flipped the pages slowly, each one heavier than the last. The financials were clean, too clean. Consolidated statements, streamlined assets, reassigned accounts. I knew how this was done. I had helped friends settle estates before. But this wasn't that. This was a transaction disguised as a gesture of care. Something made me pause on the third document from the bottom. A transfer authorization for the life insurance policy. I had seen it before, but now my eyes caught something I had missed. A handwritten note on the back. Faint, almost indiscernible. Probably from when Louise and I had met with the attorney years ago. I held the paper to the light. There it was, a short sentence in her handwriting, written in pencil, fading at the edges. For Harold, if he's still here. Beneath it, a date. 1 year ago, to the day, it knocked the breath out of me. I sat back and stared at the note. She had written it when she was still lucid, before the worst of the illness took her memory and her voice. It was her way of saying something without saying it. A message not meant for courts or banks, but for me. It wasn't a legal clause. It was an anchor. I turned the page over again, held it close. That handwriting, small, sharp, certain. I had seen it 1,000 times on grocery lists and birthday cards, in the margins of cookbooks, and inside the covers of borrowed novels. But here, it felt like a voice in the dark, reminding me that I wasn't imagining what was happening. I returned the page to the folder and left it open on the table. The tea had gone cold. I didn't touch it. My hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from clarity. The kind that doesn't bring peace, only direction. I went to the attic. I hadn't been up there in months, maybe a year. The stairs creaked under my weight, each one groaning like a warning. I pulled the chain for the bare bulb at the top. The light flickered once, then settled into a dim yellow glow. Dust swirled around me, rising from boxes that hadn't been opened in a decade. I found the filing cabinet in the far corner. Louise had insisted we keep it, even when we switched to online banking. She trusted paper more than screens. I respected that. Inside were folders labeled in her handwriting. Taxes, house repairs, medical, letters. I opened the letters folder and sat on a trunk, slowly leafing through them. Most were from friends long past. Some were from me, written in younger ink, apologizing for long hours, for forgotten dates, for arguments that feel foolish in hindsight. Near the bottom was a stack wrapped in a rubber band, notes from her mother, and beneath them, several envelopes addressed to her sister. At the very bottom, a single envelope addressed to me. My name in her hand. Nothing else. No stamp. No postmark. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed. She must have written it when her hands had already started to fail. The sentences were simple. direct. She talked about the house, about what it meant to her, about how hard she had worked to make it ours. She warned me, in her own way, that not everyone shared the same memory of its meaning, that some would see it as property, not place. She urged me to protect it, not with anger, but with patience, not with bitterness, but with boundaries. She ended the letter with a line I hadn't read in years. "Don't let grief make you silent, Harold. Speak in the ways that count." I folded the letter and put it in my shirt pocket. Back downstairs, I stood at the kitchen sink and looked out over the backyard. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows from the fence posts. I noticed a pile of broken branches beneath the oak tree. Someone had dragged them there. I hadn't. I returned to the hallway closet under the stairs. The air still held the faint odor of cigarette smoke. This time, I brought a flashlight. I scanned the baseboards and the corners. Nothing obvious, but something caught my eye. A torn piece of a document tucked behind a can of paint thinner. I pulled it out and studied it. It was a printout of a real estate brochure, a listing for a house that looked suspiciously like mine, just rendered in artificial staging. No photos of me, no trace of Louise, just generic furniture and generic sunlight pouring through untouched windows. I flipped the paper over. In the upper corner, in faint pencil, was a date. Next month, circled twice. The tea on the table had grown cold again. The folder remained open. The signature line stared back at me. But now I knew. The ink they wanted wasn't just for the house. It was for my silence. And now I had a date, a deadline, and a decision. That morning, the world outside was blanketed in snow, thick even, untouched. It had fallen overnight, covering the streets, the roofs, the sidewalks in white silence. From the kitchen window, the yard looked like a clean slate, soft and blinding in the pale light. No tire tracks, no footprints, no wind to carve lines into the surface. Just stillness. I stood at the window longer than usual. My hands rested on the edge of the sink, my knuckles pale against the metal. The glass was cold to the touch. I remembered winters like this from years ago, when Louise would wake early to heat water for Coco, when we'd shovel the driveway together, laughing at how useless we were with the heavy snow. Back then, the snow felt playful. Now, it looked sterile, sealed, as if the house itself had been buried in something final. I put on my boots and coat without thinking. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to move. The door groaned on its hinges as I stepped out. The cold slapped against my face and filled my lungs. The snow squeaked underfoot with each step. I paused at the edge of the porch, looked back. My tracks cut clearly through the pristine surface. I hated how visible they were. I walked to the shed first. I hadn't opened it since I found the footprint in the den. The padlock was stiff but opened with effort. Inside, the air was dry and full of wood dust. Everything was just as I'd left it. Tools hanging on their nails, fishing gear stacked in the corner, a cracked thermos I hadn't used since the last trip to the lake. I didn't come to retrieve anything. I just needed to be near something that hadn't shifted, something that didn't lie. I sat on the stool by the workbench. My breath came out in clouds, curling against the stale air. On the bench was an old photograph. I didn't remember leaving it there. It was of the two of us, me and Louise, taken the day we finished painting the kitchen. She had a streak of blue on her cheek. I had paint in my hair. We looked like people who had everything figured out. I turned the photo over. There was no date, no writing, just the glossy back and a faint fingerprint smudge. The stillness was broken by the distant sound of an engine. I stood and peeked out through the narrow window. A car pulled up to the house. Black, late model, unfamiliar. I waited. The engine idled for a moment before the driver stepped out. A woman, young, well-dressed, holding a tablet and a clipboard. She walked up to the front porch, took a few photos, then returned to her car. She didn't knock. She didn't look around. Just documentation. I didn't move. I stayed in the shed until she drove off. When I returned to the house, I noticed something had changed. The rug by the front door was misaligned. Not enough to call it obvious. Just enough that I knew it had been touched. The folder was no longer on the table. It was in the drawer, where I had never put it. I opened it and found everything as it had been, except now the signature line had a post-it next to it. A note written in tight handwriting. Let me know if you need help signing. T. The pen was left on top of the folder. I took it and threw it across the room. I walked into the bedroom. Her closet had fewer things again. A coat missing. The jewelry box still there, but the top tray gone. I pulled it from the shelf, looked underneath. The note she had written to me, the one I had hidden there, was also gone. I sat on the bed and listened. The house creaked, but not from the cold. It creaked like it was adjusting to new weight. I looked at the ceiling and tried to remember when this had stopped being my home and started becoming something else. A set piece, a prize, a transition. Outside, the snow still lay untouched. No prints from the woman, no marks on the driveway, like she had been a dream. A phantom sent to remind me that I was no longer invisible, but also no longer necessary. I made tea again, sat in the same chair, stared at the front door. I imagined her standing there, Louise, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp, her mouth set in that line she used when she knew something long before I did. I imagined her saying nothing, just watching. Later, I found myself back at the attic stairs. I climbed slowly, my breath loud in the narrow passage. At the top, the air was thinner, colder. I moved to the filing cabinet and opened the bottom drawer. There was one file I hadn't opened yet, one she had marked with a blue ribbon. Personal. Inside were letters, not to her, not from her, but between others. I read names I didn't recognize, conversations about property, inheritance, care options. One name kept appearing, Tanya, the same initial on the post-it. I realized then that she had known. Months before, her mind had begun to go. She had seen the preparation for my removal. One letter ended with a phrase that stuck with me. He'll never notice. Not until it's all done. I closed the folder. Back downstairs, the sun had begun to set. The snow glowed pink in the fading light. Still no footprints, as if no one had ever come or gone. I went to the den and sat down. This time, I took the folder and placed it on the floor beside me. I turned off the lamp, sat in the dark. There were no voices, no knocks, just the steady hum of a house waiting for a decision. Outside, the snow covered everything, even me. I woke before the sun, long before the world outside had remembered how to move. The air in the house felt different that morning. Not colder, not warmer, just shifted, like someone had opened a door I hadn't noticed before and let something else in. I lay there in bed for a long while, staring at the ceiling, counting the small imperfections in the paint, the way Louise used to when she couldn't sleep. I could almost hear her breath beside me, steady and close. But it was just memory, echoing inside my chest like a quiet draft. The wind had changed. I could feel it through the window pane before I even opened the curtain. It pressed against the glass, low and determined, the kind of wind that didn't scream, but whispered its intentions with patience. It had rained lightly during the night. Now the world was wet, shining, and scattered with fallen twigs. The snow was gone, melted into patches of slush and dark soil. The clean sheet had been torn away. I moved slowly through the house, barefoot on the cold floorboards, listening for sounds I wouldn't have noticed before. Each step carried more weight than it used to, not because I was weaker, but because the house no longer shared the load. It no longer felt like it carried me. I was carrying it. Its silence, its history, its betrayal. In the kitchen, the folder was back on the table. I hadn't put it there. The pen beside it was new, sleek, capped in gold. The note had changed. It was no longer a suggestion. It was a statement. For your peace of mind. I didn't touch it. Instead, I opened the back door and stepped outside into the yard. The grass squished beneath my boots. The trees shifted in the wind, their bare arms gesturing like they were trying to tell me something they had been holding on to all season. The birdbath was cracked from the freeze, leaning slightly to the left. Louise had loved that thing. She used to whistle to the sparrows, pretending they answered. I walked to the fence and stared at the neighboring houses. Most were still asleep, curtains drawn, lights off. A single porch light across the street blinked on and off, as if struggling to commit to wakefulness. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling slightly. The wind had picked up. It was pressing harder now, as if urging me to move, to do something, to stop standing still. When I came back inside, I called the bank. I asked for information. Specific, sharp, quiet. The woman on the phone sounded too cheerful for the hour, but she gave me what I needed. Transfers had been initiated. My name was still on the account, but permissions had shifted. Access had been shared. I thanked her and hung up before my voice betrayed me. I returned to the den. The folder was still there. I opened it again, slowly this time, carefully. I looked at the dates. They had been updated. Signatures I hadn't given. Authorizations I hadn't known existed. There were initials next to mine, not forged, just assumed. The wind rattled a shutter upstairs. I made a list that day. A real one, not just in my head. I took a legal pad from the drawer, the one with the old receipts, and started writing. Not things to fix or buy, just facts. The date Louise had passed. The day the new key had appeared on the hook. The first time I noticed the furniture rearranged. The moment I realized my name was being erased in slow motion. I listed the names of people I could still trust. It was a short list, mostly ghosts, but one name stood out. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years. James Walcott, a retired attorney, old fishing buddy. We hadn't spoken since the cancer took his wife, but he owed me a favor, one I'd never called in. That afternoon, I called him. The line rang 5 times before he answered. His voice was gravel, tired but solid. I said my name. There was silence, then a slow, quiet recognition. I didn't explain much. I didn't need to. He listened. That was his talent, listening between words. He told me to bring everything. Originals, copies, notes. Told me to come tomorrow. No questions. No judgments. When I hung up, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief. Not yet. But readiness. The rest of the day, I moved deliberately. I collected every document, every note Louise had written, every letter, every photo with a date. I placed them in a brown folder, not the one on the kitchen table, but my own. My copy. My history. The wind howled again near sundown. The trees bent low. Clouds gathered over the yard. The light turned yellow and strange. Storm coming. I sat on the porch with a blanket over my lap and watched the sky curl into itself. I thought about the woman in the car, the clipboard, the way she didn't knock. I thought about the missing clothes, the fading scent of Louise's shampoo, the steady shrinking of my space. They had mistaken my quiet for weakness, mistaken my slowness for surrender. But the wind was shifting now, and with it, so was I. That night, I locked every door, not out of fear, out of certainty. I packed the brown folder in my old fishing bag, set it by the front door. Before going to bed, I stood in the hallway and looked at the photo of me and Louise from the beach trip, the one in the frame she picked out at the thrift store. I whispered something only the walls could hear. The wind carried it away. The sky was the color of metal when I pulled out of the driveway, a flat gray that stretched in every direction, refusing to offer even the promise of light. The roads were wet from the night's rain, and the tires hummed a low song against the asphalt. I hadn't driven that early in years. The town was barely awake, just trucks delivering supplies to shuttered stores and a jogger or two moving through puddles with the silence of ghosts. The brown folder sat beside me on the passenger seat. I had packed it like you pack a suitcase for war, deliberately, nervously, and with the knowledge that you've probably forgotten something important. But it was thick. It held everything I had left that mattered on paper. The letter from Louise, the bank statements, the hidden authorizations, the note in her handwriting, the timeline I had drawn up, page by page. I had sorted the truth into neat layers, and now I was carrying it across town like a box of matches. James Walcott's house hadn't changed. Still the same sagging porch, the same rusted mailbox hanging by a screw. His wife's garden, now wild and overgrown, stretched around the side, like it refused to forget her. I parked on the street. He was already waiting for me at the door, wearing an old sweater and slippers, like we were just there to play cards. He didn't shake my hand. He opened the door and let me in. His office was warm and cluttered. Books, files, photographs. He gestured to a chair, and I sat without a word. The only sound was the hum of a heater by the window and the crackling of logs in the fireplace. I placed the folder on the table between us and opened it. He didn't rush. He flipped through each page with careful fingers, eyes narrowing, lips tightening slightly with every new document. Every time he reached a handwritten note or a misdated form, he paused, as if listening for something beneath the ink. After a while, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath through his nose. Then he asked me to start from the beginning. I spoke slowly. The facts, the timeline, what I had seen, what had gone missing, what had appeared without explanation. I didn't embellish. I didn't offer opinions. I simply laid down the map, one broken step at a time. His face stayed unreadable. Occasionally, he jotted something down on a yellow pad. Once, he asked me to repeat a date. Once, he tilted his head, as if trying to hear the voice of someone long gone. When I finished, he didn't speak for a long time. He leaned forward, picked up a pen, and underlined something in one of the legal documents. He tapped it once with his finger, then twice. I watched the pen dance, a slow metronome of certainty. He said what I already knew, that it wasn't just about the house, that they were preparing to remove me, politely, legally, and permanently. With permission granted by my silence. He explained that the timing was careful, the language sanitized, the trail just clean enough to avoid suspicion. But Louise's letter, the post-it, the draft transfers, they told a story louder than the documents ever could. He asked if I wanted to fight. I said no. I didn't want to fight. I wanted to flip the table. So we spent the next 2 hours building a storm out of paper. He drafted a new will. We revoked previous authorizations. We filed formal objections to financial transfers. He composed letters to banks, utilities, and 2 agencies I had never heard of. Every page was marked, signed, stamped. I watched the printer spit out copies like a machine spitting bullets. I signed my name more times in that hour than I had in the last 5 years. With each stroke of the pen, I felt something inside me align, not with anger, but with clarity. I wasn't defending my house. I was reclaiming my name. James made a final copy of the timeline and slipped it into a red envelope. He told me to keep it close, to open it again only if things escalated. I folded it in half and tucked it into the inner pocket of my coat. He walked me to the door, said nothing, just nodded. I understood. Back in the truck, the sky had darkened, not from rain, just from the sheer weight of the clouds. I didn't drive home right away. I parked near the lake instead. It was half frozen, patches of ice catching the wind in jagged sheets. I watched them break and reform, like the surface couldn't decide what shape it wanted to be. I pulled the folder into my lap and looked at it again. The same brown edges, the same faint crease on the corner. But it felt heavier now, not just in weight, but in consequence. I imagined their faces when they discovered what I had undone, what I had reclaimed. Back home, I placed the folder in the drawer where the original had sat. I left the fake one on the table. I wanted it there, waiting, still pretending to be in control. Then I brewed coffee. Strong, black, no sugar. The wind knocked softly at the window. Later I found myself walking through each room of the house, slowly, touching the walls, the doorknobs, the corners where dust gathered, and where light used to fall. Just right. I was memorizing the shape of it all, not because I feared losing it, but because I had taken it back. By nightfall, the air was restless again. Papers fluttered near the windowsill, caught in a crosscurrent from an old vent. I watched one lift off the table and spin through the air before landing upside down on the floor. I bent down to pick it up. There on the back, scribbled in a different pen, in handwriting that wasn't mine, was a single phrase. Next Tuesday, final walkthrough. It was written like a note to a realtor, a plan, without my name. I folded the paper. I fed it into the fireplace. The flame rose without hesitation. The house exhaled with me. I left before dawn. No note, no call, no sound. Just me and the old canvas bag, with the red zipper that still carried traces of motor oil in its seams. I packed light. The brown folder, the red envelope from James, one change of clothes, and a flask Louise gave me on our 40th anniversary. I didn't bring photos. I didn't bring heirlooms. Everything I needed was already in my hands. The road out of town was empty, carved clean by the night's rain. The air smelled of wet bark and distant pine, the kind of scent that reminded me of the marina where I first learned how to balance on water. The old house by the bay sat nearly hidden behind a line of trees and tall, rust-colored grass. I hadn't been there in years. I wasn't sure if the roof still held, but it was mine. Mine in a way that required no folder, no witness, no explanation. Just keys and silence. When I pulled up, the driveway was soft with mud, but the tires held. The path to the door had disappeared beneath a carpet of pine needles. The porch steps groaned under my weight but held, like a tired friend who hadn't given up entirely. I stood at the threshold and looked out over the water. It was calm. Not still. Calm. The kind of calm that doesn't beg for your attention, just offers it if you're willing. Inside, the house was as I left it. Sparse. One table, 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner, the mattress still wrapped in plastic from the last visit. A layer of dust rested on the windowsills like settled time. I opened the windows one by one and let the wind in. It filled the house slowly, not with noise, but with movement. The air shifted. I felt it in my chest. I set the folder down on the table, the red envelope on top. I didn't open either. I didn't need to. Not yet. Instead, I made a fire in the stove. It took longer than I expected. The wood was damp, the paper reluctant, but eventually the flame caught, and the stove began to breathe. I sat by it with my boots off and my back against the wall. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just sat. By midday, the fog had rolled in from the water, wrapping the house in a thick, silver-gray curtain. The sound of the lake lapping against the dock was steady, like a heartbeat I didn't know I missed. I walked down to the edge with my hands in my coat pockets, kicking stones into the shallows. One of the old rowboats was still tied there, half sunk, paint peeling. I didn't try to move it. I just looked at it and remembered how Louise used to sit in the bow, legs crossed, sketchbook on her knees, drawing the trees like she could catch the breeze in pencil. There were no messages on my phone. I hadn't turned it on. I spent the afternoon clearing out the cabinets. Mice had nested in one. I swept it out, sealed the holes, lit a candle to burn away the scent of old things. The rhythm of cleaning brought me into the moment. Cloth, bucket, rinse, repeat. It felt right, like apology made physical, like making space for something new, even if I didn't know what. As the sun lowered, the fog began to thin, revealing pieces of the horizon like forgotten notes. I stood at the window and watched the light stretch across the water. There were no neighbors here, no sounds of cars or footsteps or doors closing behind people who thought they owned time. Just the wind and the water and the creak of wood, remembering its shape. That evening, I boiled water on the stove and made instant soup. I ate it slowly, with both hands around the bowl. I thought of the meals Louise used to make. Simple things. Roasts, biscuits, black-eyed peas, food with memory inside. I didn't try to recreate it. I wasn't here to rebuild the past, just to be somewhere it could echo without being erased. I sat outside on the steps with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders and the stars overhead, scattered like stray thoughts. No one knew I was here. No one needed to. The house didn't ask questions. It didn't need permission to shelter me. It just did. At some point, I fell asleep in the chair by the stove. The fire burned low, but steady. When I woke, the world was quiet in a way that only happens when you've finally arrived where you're meant to be. I got up, stretched, poured myself a glass of water from the jug, and opened the red envelope. Inside was the copy of the timeline and a single note from James. Let them knock, but only answer if you want to. I folded it back into the envelope and placed it in the drawer. I walked to the back of the house where the narrow screened porch overlooked the lake. The boards were warped, and one of the screens had torn, letting in the wind. I didn't fix it. I sat in the rocking chair, the one she used to read in, and watched the ripples stretch across the surface of the water. No lights, no voices, no signatures needed. Just the sound of my name still intact inside my own mouth, and a house that waited without demand. A house on the water where nothing needed to be proved. The second morning came like a slow exhale. I opened my eyes to the pale blue light that filtered through the thin curtains, and for a few seconds I forgot where I was. The ceiling above me was wooden, slanted, imperfect. Unlike the plaster back home, the sounds around me were unfamiliar too. No cars in the distance, no heat system kicking in. Just the soft creaking of the walls and the steady hush of the lake pressing its rhythm against the shore. I sat up slowly, listening to the quiet like it was music. It had depth to it. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from the presence of stillness. The fire in the stove had long gone cold, but it had left behind a gentle warmth that clung to the air like a memory. I made coffee on the old camping burner I kept in the back cupboard. It took time. The kettle shook slightly, the flame low and stubborn. I liked the slowness of it. The ceremony. When the coffee was ready, I poured it into the same mug I had used the day before. Green ceramic with a chip on the rim. Louise had used it when we came up here in the fall. She said it made the coffee taste more like the earth. I stepped out onto the porch with the mug in both hands. The lake stretched out before me, still and gray, glassy in the early light. Thin strips of mist hovered just above the surface, dancing slowly as the wind shifted. The sky was clouded, but not heavy. There was no threat of rain, only the weightless pressure of an overcast day. Waves lapped the shoreline with a rhythm too perfect to be man-made. Each one arrived with a soft kiss against the rocks, then slid back, erasing its own trace. Over and over, patient and eternal. I watched them for a long time. They didn't ask anything of me. They didn't care what I had left behind. They just moved. I didn't check my phone. I had left it off since arriving. It sat on the small table near the door, untouched, its blank screen facing the ceiling. I had started to forget it was even there. Out here, it had no meaning, no signal, no pull. Just a plastic thing that once tied me to a world that now felt further away than the horizon. I spent the day doing small tasks. I chopped wood behind the shed, slow and steady, letting the rhythm of the axe sink into my bones. I carried logs in, stacked them beside the stove. I swept the porch, cleaned the windows, wiped down the table. Not because it needed to be done, but because it grounded me. It reminded me that I still had hands, that I still made marks on the world. At lunch, I sat on the dock with a sandwich and watched the wind move across the lake in invisible paths. Birds skimmed the surface. Somewhere far off, a loon called once, long and low. The sound curled through the air and disappeared like a thought that couldn't finish itself. I sat there until the sun passed directly overhead, and the sky lightened enough to let blue push through the gray. I walked the perimeter of the house slowly that afternoon, inspecting the siding, the foundation, the windows. The house was tired, but not failing. It had aged in a way that felt earned. Like me, every board had survived something. Every nail held more than just wood together. It held time. Louise had said once that this house would outlive us both. She was right. Later, I sat on the floor with the brown folder open in front of me, not reading, just feeling its weight. I thought about all the versions of myself contained in those pages, the versions others had tried to file, to define, to silence. I let my hand rest on the cover, then closed it gently. I tucked it back into the drawer and left it there. It no longer needed to be on the table. Evening came quietly. The sky turned amber, and the trees cast long, soft shadows on the lake. I lit the fire again, the crackle of dry wood filling the room with a comfort I hadn't felt in years. The house smelled of pine and smoke. I sat with the lights off, watching the flames reflect on the window glass. The water outside had darkened into ink, its surface now indistinguishable from the sky. I poured a glass of whiskey and sat on the porch steps. The stars emerged one by one, slowly at first, then in clusters. I sipped in silence, letting the warmth of the drink spread through me like a slow, honest truth. I felt small, but not in a way that frightened me. In a way that reminded me the world was wide and would continue with or without my permission. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to defend anything. The wind was calm. The waves were steady. I whispered her name once into the night air, just to see if the lake would carry it. It didn't echo. It just disappeared. And that was enough. I woke to rain. Not a storm, not a downpour, just a steady whisper across the roof. The kind of rain that doesn't announce itself, that simply appears and takes the shape of everything it touches. I lay in bed listening to it, the sound of it tapping against the glass, the way it softened the house. I could smell it before I even moved, a dampness in the air mixed with cedar and ash and old wood that had soaked through too many winters. I rose without rush, my body slow but willing. The room was dim and blue, the lake outside a sheet of dull steel. The waves were quieter than before, blurred by the falling rain. There was no wind, no birds, no movement beyond the gentle pulling and releasing of the shoreline. The world had drawn itself inward. I made tea instead of coffee. Something lighter, something that felt less like armor and more like breath. The kettle steamed gently as I stood at the window, the mug warming my hands while the fog crept closer from the tree line. The edges of the world softened with it. The dock vanished first, then the garden, then the road that led back toward everything I had left behind. It was as if the land itself wanted me to forget. By midday, I had packed the essentials, not because I was leaving, but because I needed to remember what it meant to choose. I folded my clothes, cleaned the dishes, sealed the folder again. I didn't know if I would use it, but I didn't throw it away. Some things aren't meant to be erased, just put in their rightful place. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside. The rain had thinned to mist, a fine drizzle that clung to my skin and jacket. I walked along the edge of the lake, each footstep sinking slightly into the soft ground. I passed the shed, the boat, the crooked bird bath. Every part of the house seemed to look at me differently now, as if recognizing me for the first time, not as a visitor, but as someone who had decided. At the bend where the woods began, I stopped. There was a fork in the path, one trail deeper into the trees, the other curving back toward the gravel road where I had parked my truck days earlier. No signs, no markers, just a choice. I turned away from the road. The forest was quiet. Wet leaves clung to my boots, and the sound of dripping branches followed me like a second heartbeat. I didn't know where the trail led. I didn't need to. I wasn't escaping. I wasn't hiding. I was simply moving in a direction that wasn't dictated by someone else's schedule, someone else's folder, someone else's idea of what I owed. The trees grew denser the farther I walked. Thicker trunks, taller shadows, more silence. I welcomed it. I breathed in the deep scent of earth and rot and rain. I stopped at a fallen log, ran my hand across its mossy bark, and sat down. The woods wrapped around me like a cathedral. Above me, mist wove through the branches in thin veils, and I felt the weight of years slide from my shoulders. I stayed there for a long time. When I returned to the house, it was nearly dusk. The clouds had lifted just enough to let in a sliver of amber light that spread across the lake like fire on glass. The wind had returned, but only gently. The house creaked as I opened the door, and the warmth inside greeted me like an old friend. I lit the stove, peeled off my coat, and sat in the quiet. Later, as darkness settled, I wrote a letter. I didn't address it. I didn't plan to mail it. I simply wrote. I wrote about what I had seen, what I had chosen, what I would no longer permit. I didn't use names. I didn't assign blame. I just named the truth and let it sit on the page without apology. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it inside the folder. Then I sealed the folder with a piece of twine and tucked it back into the drawer. I went outside one last time before bed. The stars had returned, faint, scattered, but steady. The lake reflected them like a memory. The world was quiet again, not with silence, but with understanding. I stood there for a while, barefoot on the porch, the boards cold beneath my feet. I looked out over the water and whispered her name. Not from grief, not from longing, but from gratitude. She had known, long before I did. She had written the truth on the back of paper I almost threw away, and now the wind had shifted. There was no need for goodbye, just a turn, unannounced, but chosen.